and being, closely held. And there's also some problems with a lot of the suppliers not being automotive suppliers. They're not used to the volume. They're not used to the quality levels that American consumers demand out of their vehicles. I mean, we don't want to take our vehicle to the dealer for warranty. We don't want it to break, period. Well, some of the suppliers that are not automotive are not used to that. They're used to a 2% fallout rate. That won't cut it for American auto buyers. So The industry itself has had to go through a metamorphosis from top to bottom, and that's tough to do, especially when the federal government is not supporting the industry the way it said it was going to.
No, not at all. A couple of weeks ago, I had a fellow on who is working on a flying motorcycle. He's got a prototype out there. Neat device. I don't know if it'll work. I don't know if people will buy it, but it is kind of innovative, Brooks.
Well, it would certainly be Darwinian for bad drivers, I think. One of the things that makes this process so difficult is the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. And I applaud them for their work at trying to make vehicles safer, because not everybody's a great driver. And now we've thrown in the variable of iPhones and Androids, and we're trying to drive and do that at the same time. So it's a good thing that vehicles are getting a lot more safe. And that's kind of what's made the road a little longer, a little more difficult.
I think so, too. How much would it cost to sell a vehicle if you can get it to marketplace?
The Everest, which is our little 100-mile range light pickup truck, will carry about 1,000 pounds, about 100 miles. The retail price is going to be around $25,000, and that's before rebates. Now
that's not bad.
It's not too bad. Now, the rebates are kind of tricky. The $7,500 one that everyone's heard about only applies to the first 100,000 vehicles from any one plant. That's what the legislation says. It is a tax rebate. So
from any one plant.
From any one plant.
So if you have 10 plants, you've got how many vehicles? 75,000?
Yeah, you could produce 1 million vehicles then, 100,000 vehicles per plant. But the tooling would kill you. You'd never be able to do that. You'd have to tool up one plant and make it go. The rebate is kind of tricky because it's based on income, it's based on the price of the vehicle, and there are some snags to it. If you take the rebate, you're going to get it at tax time, like having a couple extra kids to deduct on your tax return. So it's not at the date of sale, although they're trying to change the legislation to do that. But you also have to waive some of your rights as though you signed a 1040. They have the right to know where the money went. They have the right to investigate if they sense any kind of fraud. And I can see that. I mean,
sure.
The cash for clunkers thing was such a debacle. They don't want to go through that again. The good news is that there are state rebates, there are county rebates, city rebates, and really by the time you become savvy with these, and your local dealer will help you with that, you might get into one of these for $16,000, $17,000, and when you're driving it for basically $20 a month, you're miles ahead of the game.
And is your insurance costs lower?
Yeah, your insurance cost is lower because it only has a 100-mile range, and you're not going to go out and drive 30,000 miles a year in an electric vehicle. That's not what they're made for. They're made for the daily commute, those little short trips, 10, 12, 20, 30 miles, that add up to be 100 miles a day or 150 miles a day.
School, shopping, things like that. Hey, Brooks, stay with us. We're going to come back with you in just a moment on Coast to Coast AM. Well, for just pocket change every day, just pocket change, you can become a Coast Insider. Read all about it, formerly Streamlink, by going to coasttocoastam.com. When we come back, we'll begin to talk about HARP, weather manipulation, with Brooks Agnew right here on Coast to Coast AM. And welcome back to Coast to Coast. Brooks, we've talked about HARP on this program before, specifically with Dr. Nick Begich. Tell me about your involvement with HARP.
Well, okay. I published a paper, I think it was probably back in the mid-'80s, and then I republished it on the Internet, and Nick read that paper This was, I think, in the mid '90s, and I had developed an improvement to a technology called ground probing radar. When I was working on my undergraduate stuff, I ended up in the oil fields doing surveys, and we had a very strange thing happen one day. We used these 6-meter marine radios to communicate in the oil fields. And one day we were in Kentucky, and we were in a known oil area, and we were taking some surveys. And I was communicating with the mobile unit who was out there holding a prismatic mirror that I was going to bounce a laser off of. And I was trying to communicate with him with this 25-watt marine radio, and he couldn't hear me. And we were waving at each other. We could see each other. We were about a quarter of a mile apart, but he couldn't hear me. Well, these radios will go 30 miles sometimes if the conditions are right, but certainly a quarter of a mile. So I motioned for him to drive back over to me, and he came back over to me. I said, "Hey, why won't you answer me?" He said, "I'm not hearing anything over the radio." I said, "You're kidding me. Where is the radio energy going?" So I hooked up a dB meter to the audio output of the other radio. And sure enough, I keyed down on it, and he drove off with the radio keyed down, and he got to a certain spot in this field, and bam, that field just dropped out like it was gone, like it was being sucked straight into the ground. And I said, wow, I wonder what that looks like. So we got a spectrometer, and we put it on a spectrometer kind of shows the different peaks of it, like you're looking at a wave shape on a screen. And sure enough, this thing was dropping about 90 dB. That's like 10 to the ninth. That's how much it was dropping. And then in this was a wave shape that seemed to indicate that something was resonating back some of that energy. And I began to match that against drill cuttings for the next 3 years as my undergraduate program. And thanks to Dr. Buckman at Western Kentucky University, we developed it into a system that we called ground probing radar.
Okay.
And from that point on, we located 55 oil wells in 9 states using this technology, and it worked. It got to depth amazingly accurately, and Halliburton was interested, and I was ready to graduate and move on, so I did. But I paid for part of my college with some of that money, and it was good. But an interesting thing happened when we were up in Roseburg, Oregon, in 1987, I think it was. We were surveying for a gas well for a guy who was a sod farmer. He sold fescue sod. And it was a foggy morning. I had set up my base unit inside of a camper on the back of a Ford four-wheel drive pickup, and the mobile unit was now on an ATV.
You sound like one of those tornado chasers.
Yeah. Oh, we'd really improved the equipment. So he took off driving into the fog, and we're communicating by radio. And then I say, okay, that's, out far enough. Go ahead and turn the equipment on. He turned the equipment on. 50 watts as all this was broadcasting into the ground. And within about 2 seconds, there was a loud bang, and the ground rumbled, and the earth shook. And he came back over the radio, sounded like he was white as a ghost. He said, "Did I do that?" I said, "I don't know. What happened?" He said, I turned on the broadcaster, and an earthquake happened right underneath me. So we wrote it down in the lab notebook, and that came out in the paper, that maybe we were resonating with something that was already tight as a rubber band underneath the ground, and we triggered it and let it go, and that's what caused it. It was like a cause and effect. So that's what Dr. Begich picked up on in my paper, and he contacted me, and he said, "We're doing a documentary called Holes in Heaven, and it's a sequel to his book called Angels Don't Play This Harp."
That's right.
And when his film crew came down and I showed him my data, I spent a day on the phone with Dr. Bernard Eastlund, who was the actual patent inventor of HARP. And I was white-faced at the end of this, George, because I realized that they were playing in the same frequencies that I was playing in the mid-'80s, only they weren't playing with 50 watts. They were playing with millions of watts. And I raised an alarm bell. I said, "You guys don't know what you're doing. You're like doing this hydrogen bomb thing all over again. You've got to listen to some reason here."
Or maybe they did know, Brooks, what they were doing. If you get
well, that's even more frightening if that's true, because
yes, it is.
Besides the side effects of being able to trigger earthquakes, and there, by the way, some telltale signs that HAARP is a predecessor to these, manipulating weather by moving clouds around, and we can certainly talk about what we did with the History Channel and with True TV with Jesse Ventura. There's also the danger of a solar tap, and we can get into that later. That's a real scary one.
Let's get into the triggering of earthquakes with this technology a little bit more, and how it works.
Well,
what happens?
That's a good question. It's hard to do on the radio because I'm sitting with my hands in the room and you can't see it. Let's say you had an acoustical guitar out of its case and it was leaned up against the wall in the corner of your room, and then you turned your stereo up loud with rock and roll music on it. Somewhere in that music, a frequency will be just right to pluck a string on that guitar just as surely as someone went over and plucked it with a pick. Actually, what's happening is the guitar is absorbing energy out of the room full of noise that's exactly the right frequency that's perfect for that string to vibrate. This is how HAARP triggers earthquakes. HAARP is the High-Frequency Active Auroral Research Program. It is designed to create a radio frequency beam, like we're talking over the radio right now, with a lower frequency message carried on top of it, like our voices are going over the radio right now.
Yeah.
They send ELF, which is extremely low frequencies, VLF, and ULF signals, obviously extreme, very, and ultra-low frequencies. Now, these have a lot of applications. Of course, communicating with submarines was their primary budget reason. But as it turns out, some of these frequencies, as Dr. Nick Begich will testify, can have biological and physiological effects, and others can have geological effects, like the guitar string in the corner of the room. The ground, structures in the ground, can vibrate with those very low frequencies. And obviously, the louder you turn the music up, the harder the string on the guitar vibrates. So the idea was to maybe use it to do kind of a CAT scan of the earth, to look for oil, to look for water, to look for precious metals in the ground. But when it's concentrated and turned on certain areas that have a propensity for geotechnic activity, which we now call earthquakes,
yep.
It could trigger them. And we did it with 50 watts. And there's some evidence that it has been done with not maybe our HAARP, but other HAARPs that are existing on the planet.
This rumble that you heard with the 50 watter,
yeah.
How loud was it?
Well, it was audible, but it was such that it's sort of like somebody grabbing the carpet you're standing on and giving it a whip. It was like a wave that just went under us. It rocked the whole camper. It was probably a 4.5 or 5 earthquake. And for Oregon, that's not uncommon, but to have it cause an effect like that was notable. So we made a note.
But you're pretty sure though you triggered it.
Well, I would say it's cause and effect. I wouldn't say that I could go out and cause an earthquake every single time. I'm saying that the conditions were just right, and we added that extra push, that activation energy that caused it to slip and cause the earthquake.
So if you had a bigger device, i.e. HAARP, turned it on, it could do, in your opinion, some incredible damage.
Well, not just in my opinion. There are a lot of experts that agree on this, so much so that there was a treaty drafted shortly after HAARP was built. And in that treaty, the United States agreed, and this was signed by Secretary of State Cohen, not to use HAARP as a weapon.
How do we know that HAARP wasn't developed for that purpose?
Well, I would say, based on our illustrious, trustworthy Wars R Us department, that probably the opposite is true. And I mentioned in the start of this segment that it's the same mentality as those that launched the first hydrogen bomb. I did some of my postgraduate work in Oak Ridge, so you hear